Good morning, dear friends. Good morning, dear speakers. Or is it afternoon? We are happy to start our panel, which is dedicated to the trade wars and their impact on the world economy. So we've been witnessing the emerging trade wars among China and the United States, often engulfing other nations. Trade wars damage all countries involved, as well as the international economy as a whole. Ukraine is not an exclusion here, and quite soon, possibly the metallurgic industry of Ukraine is probably going to take a unilateral strike from the United States, as well as from the protective measures of the EU and Turkey. 9 countries, including the EU, China, Mexico, Canada, Russian Federation, Turkey, Norway, Switzerland, has initiated an arbitration with the WTO regarding the trade barriers and tariffs from the United States. China's relationship with market economy is still a matter of question. More and more countries are starting to use exclusions from WTO rules, which can have a domino effect on the trade system as a whole. It's worth noting that the United States is also blocking arbiters in the appeals body of the World Trade Organization, which lowers the efficiency of the international dispute resolution system. Many international experts believe that this war has been started to change the landscape of international trade. So is business ready to these new rules? Or how does Ukrainian business protect its interests in this new world order? We are going to talk about this with the representatives of our panel discussion, with the ambassador, the representative of the EU, Ambassador Mingarelli, with the representative of with Renato Antonini, the managing partner of Schnitzer Law, which consults business and states and in public procurement, Johannes Schnitzer, with Emma Turas, the executive director of Canada-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce, Denis Morozov, the director of economy and finance, board member of Interpipe, and Igor Guzhva, leading expert of market economy development and CMD Ukraine, PhD in economics and active economic statesman in Ukraine. We'd like to start our discussion from the speech of Ambassador Mingarelli. You are one of the most experienced European statespeople. You have negotiated and signed the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, so we might assume that liberal values for you are more clear and understandable. So in this regard, we'd like to ask a question. What does the world expect from the trade war? How do we react to these new challenges?
Thank you. It's a pleasure, obviously, for the European Union to be associated to this forum and to have the possibility to exchange views on this extremely interesting topic. When one looks at the world today, he has many reasons to be concerned. Because, as you said in your introduction, there is no doubt that the international rules-based trading system is today under attack from many continents, by the way. And we consider in the European Union that this is something that is threatening the basis of our prosperity. It's clear that if for short-term domestic gains, an increasing number of states and organizations take the risk of undermining the global multilateral trading system, the risk exists of a global recession, and therefore we should be all aware of this risk and mobilized to avoid such a situation. There are many reasons to explain this particular situation. You know that we have many economic changes triggered by the technological progress. You know that we have increasing difficulties to manage migration flows. You know as well that there is a rapid growth of emerging economies, which is creating tension in some countries. So for all these reasons, there is a kind of panic which has been triggering this rising tension and attacks on the global trading system. But we, in the EU, continue to believe that trade is important and that we have to avoid getting the multilateral trading system taken as a scapegoat for all difficulties that we can face today. Trade, obviously, and I will not have to be long because most of you are convinced about that, but trade has brought multiple benefits. Trade has been contributing to economic growth, has been increasing the range and affordability of goods and services, and has been a contributor to the reduction of poverty that we have been witnessing on many continents, especially in Asia, over the last decade. So for all these reasons, we have to keep and ensure that trade is not tomorrow at risk. By the way, it's not only about economy. There is no need that, no doubt that thanks to the expansion of trade, cultural links between the various continents have been strengthening over the last decades. At the same time, for us, it's clear that protectionism does not protect. Those who argue that it is necessary to resort to protectionism to protect the most vulnerable are wrong. Recent history clearly shows that protectionism, in the first place, hits the poorest hardest, the very ones whom protectionism was supposed to help in the first place. And I insist on that. For us in the EU, protectionism is not an answer to the rise of inequalities. It is true that there is a rise of inequalities between continents and within each continent. And we have to fight this, because for us, the rise of inequalities is not acceptable. But at the same time, we are convinced that protectionism is not at all an answer to the rise of inequalities. On the contrary, protectionism hits the poorest. And I am ready, obviously, to come back on this if some of you have doubts. I have already exhausted my time. Yes? Almost. 5 minutes, okay. So, we believe that there are imbalances and gaps in the current rule book underpinning international trade, that these gaps concern mainly industrial subsidies, distortions created by state-owned companies, intellectual property theft, and investment barriers, especially in China. So there is no doubt that we have to address these shortcomings and imbalances. But to do that, we have to modernize WTO and not destroy WTO. I insist on that. On our agenda, our priority should be to modernize WTO in order to keep a relevant and effective rules-based international trading system. And we have started to work with the US, with China, and other countries to modernize the WTO. Regarding the US, despite a tough rhetoric, the US remains obviously a key ally and a critical player in the global trading environment. If we want to bring the US on board, we need to convince them that China will play by the rules. They are the root of many of the problems we face, without any doubt, but we have to intensify our negotiation with China. We already engage with the US and Japan through trilaterals, and we give us a forum to discuss subsidies, WTO rulebook, and build US confidence in multilateralism. This is important. In all our bilateral discussion with the US, we insist on the need to maintain, protect, and develop multilateralism in the trade area and in other areas such as security. In July, we have been able to reach a bilateral political agreement with the US to enhance the US-European Union relation. This averted a trade dispute that would have disrupted open trade flows between the US and the EU. With China, we encourage China to take up its responsibilities at the WTO. There is no doubt that if China wants to be considered a global player, they need to be a member of the global community. And it's clear that China has to lose a lot from the failure of the WTO. Therefore, one of the most important decisions of our last EU-China summit was to launch a high-level working group on WTO reform. In addition to that, the EU has been negotiating a number of bilateral trade pacts with many countries. 12 countries, including Ukraine, Canada, Singapore, Vietnam, and several African nations. We really want, once again, to strengthen free trade, to correct the current gaps and imbalances, but to maintain a multilateral trade order based on commonly agreed rules. We have an agreement as well with Mexico. We are trying to speed up our negotiation with Mercosur, and we have launched recently new negotiation with countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Chile. As regards Ukraine, we know that we have a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement to be implemented. It is very important for us to speed up the implementation of this agreement, which will progressively take the Ukrainian economy in the European Union single market. I think that I can stop there. My main message is we are aware that the current trading system has gaps and imbalances, but the answer is not protectionism. The answer is to modernize WTO through global negotiation and to strengthen the international rules-based trading system. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency Ambassador. So we understood that protectionism is not an option for the European Union to protect European manufacturers. At the same time, could you kindly answer what are the possible compromises that European Union is considering on the negotiations with the United States to finalize or to resolve the ongoing trade disputes?
Details about the ongoing negotiation with the US. We are just trying to convince our US allies that it would be in nobody's interest to disrupt trade flows between both sides of the Atlantic. And we had a successful negotiation. President Juncker had successful negotiation in July in Washington. It was at the end of July. On this basis, experts are talking. We are willing to listen to the concern expressed by our American allies, and we hope that we will find a compromise which will maintain and even increase the trade flows between the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean.
Спасибо, господин посол. Рената, вы практикуете в сфере международной торговли и национальной безопасности, специализируетесь на торговой защите, представляли интересы украинских... Мы имеем проблемы с переводом.
You represented the interests of Ukrainian. Renata, the question is to you. You practice in the sphere of international trade and national security. Your specialty is trade security. You have represented the interests of Ukrainian and European enterprises in trade investigations. So my question is the reform of trade security of European Union an effective one? And what should we expect from the reforming process at WTO?
Invitation in this forum. Indeed, as Ambassador Mingarelli was mentioning, we are going through very difficult times. I would focus as per question on trade protection. And when it comes to trade protection, there is a system which is the trade defense instrument, which is governed WTO, which at this moment is used in ways which are very dangerous when it comes to compliance with WTO law, with WTO principles. We have measures which are adopted on the basis of national security, and we will have a look at this. We have safeguard measures which are adopted with serious doubts as to whether the conditions to adopt safeguard measures actually exist. And there are changes to national laws that govern trade defense, which are also equally doubtful when it comes to compliance with WTO. So what is actually going on? Well, when it comes to trade defense, the answer, as far as I'm concerned, is that countries, WTO members, are stretching the rules, are trying to go for protectionist measures using different patterns, using different ways. Certain countries, they use the national security exception to go to impose measures which are quasi-safeguard measures. Other countries, they actually go into safeguard, and they apparently comply with safeguard principles or rules provided at WTO level. But when you analyze the measures, you will discover that that is not the case. Moreover, when it comes specifically to the European Union, in the European Union, there has been an amendment, a change in the methodology which is used to calculate dumping when it comes to China. I mean, for those who are, let's say, following anti-dumping or trade defense, but anti-dumping in particular, China was subject to a special system, which was the no-market economy treatment, which was also covering Ukraine until 2002. So Ukraine knows what this is about. Without making trying to keep this short, because of WTO obligations, this has been changed. But there are strong doubts that the new methodology will be and is WTO compliant. And the problem comes into the reality, which is the WTO reform, which is the real need. The real need is to sit down and amend the rules. Amend the rules because these rules apparently are not able anymore to address problems. For instance, Ambassador Mingarelli mentioned subsidies. This is an issue which is on the table. How can WTO deal with subsidies? At the moment we have a legislation, we have a system which addresses mainly the concept of export subsidies or specific subsidies, but this is not something which is, for instance, in line with the system that we have in the EU, which is a state aid system, and that is much more strict when it comes to subsidies, and it doesn't really marry well with the Chinese system of state-owned enterprises, very active into the private business. Now, the WTO instrument is not able at the moment to deal with this. I'll give you a clear example, which is the way that the European Union tried in the past, failing to deal with this, which is, for instance, the export taxes. The European Union decided to impose anti-dumping measures on imports from Argentina of biodiesel, and they used a specific rule in order to decide that there was a distortion of costs, and therefore, let's say, go for a measure which was higher than that without this kind of approach. Now, this led to a WTO dispute, and that dispute showed that this instrument could not be used. So the same type of issues are going to be faced vis-à-vis China on the basis of the present rules. When the European Union will impose measures on China based on the new rules, China will go to WTO. Now China has already brought a dispute against the market economy status, let's say, late abolition, withdrawal, and now it will be on the new methodology. Again, this is not it's a problem linked to the fact that the WTO is not able to respond to these matters, and we need to sit down and find solution before it is too late. And why before it is too late? Because of the national security issue. The national security issue, as far as I'm concerned, that's my personal opinion, is much more important than one can think. Because what the United States is doing, and I would not take position whether they're right or wrong, the fact is that there are a number of measures which are based on a national security exception. The fact is that there are a number of disputes which are presently supposed to deal with the national security exception. Now, the question that I have is, are we going to really get an answer out of that? Is the WTO the right forum to get us an answer as to whether certain measure can or cannot be exempted from the WTO obligations based on a national security exception? Well, I don't think so. At this moment, it is not the right forum, because at this moment we have a very weak appellate body. The appellate body, as was mentioned before, is not being renewed. The members are not being renewed, and that means that very soon it will be inoperable. The WTO is at risk. We have problems within the WTO. There are, one day yes, one day no, there are statements of important partners declaring that they will be out, they will leave the WTO. Now, the national security exception is a very important exception which is there to ensure an important protection of the states, the interests of the state. Now, do we really think that if a WTO dispute will say that member states are not allowed to use national security in a way or in another, that will be something which will force certain members to do that? For me, that's impossible. if there will be a dispute resolution saying that national security does not allow to do certain things, there will be members leaving the WTO. On the other hand, if there will be a finding that says that national security allows to take certain measures, isn't that actually a justification for any measures? So do we really want the WTO judicature to take position on this and therefore make the WTO system unviable? I personally believe that this is a matter for member states, for members of the WTO to negotiate, to discuss. I strongly believe that there should be no real decisions when it comes to panels and appellate bodies on this. This is a matter that should be discussed and negotiated between WTO members. And that is the start of the WTO reform that is mentioned, which is for me a precondition in order to ensure the WTO will continue to operate in a very positive way in which it has operated so far.
То есть правильно ли мы понимаем?
Do I understand it correctly that we shouldn't expect in the nearest future explanations from the dispute organs, the criteria for exclusions in the national security sphere? Should we expect for criteria?
That there will be a finding saying whether or not the WTO allows or doesn't allow. So it is possible. There is a dispute ongoing between Russia and Ukraine, and the panel report is expected early this year. Now the question is whether this report would be eventually adopted, whether it would go to the appellate body, and so on and so forth. The question is, do we really want case law? I mean, it's possible to have case law on this, of course. Now, the opinions on whether or not this is allowed are variegated. We can discuss this probably for hours about whether or not this is allowed. The question is whether this is a matter for the WTO case law to govern. I mean, we have had very strong problems because of zeroing in dumping. Now, zeroing in dumping is much less important matter than national security, and because of zeroing, well, we have one of the partially the reasons why we have such a crisis in WTO is also linked to the disputes on zeroing. So I don't know whether having disputes on national security can help the functioning of the WTO.
Спасибо большое, Рената.
Thank you very much, Renata. Johannes, you are an expert on legislation of the state procurement. It's important that you granted help to Ukraine when it joined GPA, the WTO agreement on procurement, and also harmonization of Ukrainian legislation with the European legislation. So would you please tell us how the trade war will influence the state procurement, and should Ukrainian companies be worried about the Ukrainian policy of Trump government?
Actually, I have to answer it with a typical lawyer's response, so it depends. I think what is really important to note is when we talk about public procurement, we talk about, and maybe this is a surprise for the audience, we talk about the largest marketplace in the world. So governments at all levels worldwide spend 9.5 trillion. This is 9,500 billion US dollars every year. So governments spend enormous amounts of money, from pencils to pharmaceuticals to airports. And answering your question, yes, a trade war will affect public procurement, and most likely in a negative way, because the basic idea of opening up public procurement markets is that the government has the opportunity to buy less expensive or to buy higher quality products from foreign companies. So as you mentioned, I had the privilege to assist Ukraine to join the government procurement agreement under the framework of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And this is actually something very remarkable what actually Ukraine achieved, because what does the GPA allow? It allows a Ukrainian company to compete for public contracts abroad. And this on the principle of non-discrimination. This means, in principle, I'm a lawyer, in principle is always an important word. It means that, for instance, if a Ukrainian company is participating in a tender procedure in the United States, actually this US government entity has to treat the Ukrainian company not less favorable than a US company. So this is the basic idea. But of course, it's absolutely true that the government procurement agreement does not cover every public procurement procedure. It does not cover every type of procurement. It does also not cover any government entity. So actually, every country negotiated exceptions. And for instance, the United States, because you actually approached me and wanted to ask how actually the Trump administration, the policy of the Trump administration has an impact actually in the area of public procurement. The government procurement agreement, as I said, does apply to high volume tenders, so not to smaller ones. And what actually the United States did, they also negotiated some carve-outs under the government procurement agreement. For instance, they set aside, so this means they reserved some contract for small and medium companies, US companies. And the Trump administration is pursuing an American first policy. This is true. I think it was in 2017, President Trump actually passed an order, Hire American, Buy American order, which promotes the use of US-made products. And again, as I said, not all government contracts are covered by the GPA, which in principle is not allowing binational. So the basic idea, and I think this is important, the government procurement agreement is actually the opposite. It does not allow price preferences or actually to treat foreign products or foreign bidders less favorable than domestic ones. But as I said, for smaller contracts, actually the Trump administration is free to promote domestic industry. So that's correct. And this is, of course, also a concern for Ukrainian companies which actually would like to participate in US tenders.
Is it possible that other countries shall fill the niche in the US, the niche freed by China? And if so, will these countries, can Ukraine be one of those countries promoting its goods in the state procurement, in the government procurement sphere?
So what's important to note is actually the US federal public procurement system creates a so-called walled garden, which means that actually a company from a country which did not conclude an agreement with the United States opening up public procurement markets, or is not a member of the GPA, actually is not allowed to participate in public contracts. And China is an interesting case. China is not a member of the WTO government procurement agreement. Actually, I think China is now in the 11th year of negotiations. But for the time being, a Chinese company is actually not allowed to participate in tender procedures of the federal state. And answering your question, yes. So a Ukrainian company could take advantage and could get into this niche. And for this reason, it's very, very important that, and as you said, I had the privilege to assist Ukraine to join this government procurement agreement. But now it's really time to start competing for public contracts abroad, because if not a Ukrainian company is doing it, an Austrian company is doing it. So competition is tough, and it, of course, will take some time, but I would strongly encourage Ukrainian companies to also compete for public contracts abroad. And coming to the second part of your question, what is also important to note that other markets, of course, remain open. So we see the policy of the Trump administration, but the government procurement agreement under the WTO has 46 or 47 member countries, of course, including all member countries of the European Union. But the public procurement market of Canada remains open, and the public procurement market of Switzerland remains open. And most importantly, the public procurement market of the European Union remains open. And this is by far the largest and most important trading partner of Ukraine. And what is interesting and maybe surprising, actually, because Ukraine joined the government procurement agreement, it already enjoys access to all 28, in a couple of months, only 27 EU member countries before even starting an accession process to the European Union. So the European Union remains one of your most important trading partners. So get out there and try to win public contracts abroad.
In this case, does the European Union apply the so-called smart protectionist restrictions in trade? Especially with regard to Ukraine.
In principle, the EU public procurement directives, they actually have the same principle as the WTO government procurement agreement, which is based on non-discrimination and equal treatment. But let's face it, it's true that actually governments across the globe, but also in the European Union, always have used also government procurement to promote domestic industry. So it would be naive to say that actually every member country of the European Union is very happy if there is actually international competition. But I think we come maybe to this question later, but the basic idea is that a Ukrainian company can participate on the same terms in a tender procedure, for instance, in Italy or in Austria. But in return, of course, an Austrian company has the right to participate in Ukrainian on the same terms.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for this amazing presentation and your answers to my quite acute questions. To some, maybe they were more interesting. To some, they were not maybe so interesting. But thank you very much. Emma, you are in a good way a lobbyist of Canadian-Ukrainian interests. And thanks to you, the Ukrainian and Canadian business and trade is developing. So I'd like to ask you on how does Canada react to trade barriers and protectionism? Does Canadian business feel the shell shock of these trade wars? I could say that our chamber has been developing trade relationships between Ukraine and Canada, and there are many colleagues here that have advanced much further, such as the Ministry of Economic Development, the Export Promotion Office, which has advanced a lot, and we've contributed a lot to building these relationships. So how did Canada react to the protectionist measures from the side of the United States? Well, you see, this is a two-way street. On the one hand, there is liberalization of trade. On the other hand, there is protectionism, and there's liberalization. The liberalization mostly concerns the most favored nation. Usually these are the poorest nations, but this doesn't really help because their poverty is perpetuated, even though they still enjoy some preferences in foreign trade. Protectionism doesn't really work, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples. You know that the United States have initiated a revision of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA. It's a trade agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and in principle, this agreement had been signed in 1991. It's been working for 25 years, and we know that maybe in 5 years after the signing of this agreement in Canada, after a long crisis, and a complicated crisis, we have enjoyed some economic growth, and NAFTA, I think, contributed to that. But any relationship has to evolve over time. And you know, in the beginning, Canada was, of course, somewhat frustrated, but then they have regrouped and they have sent a distinguished representative. This is Christina Freeland and her team, and she was able to reach a last-minute agreement in September. She has reached an agreement on USMCE, and maybe by the end of November this agreement will end up being signed. But before it's signed, what I can share at this point is there are several examples of agreements that we reached between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and how does the Canadian market react to that? We all know very well that the meat and dairy industry is especially protected by each respective nation, especially dairy. And in Canada, dairy is very developed, and Canadian farmers are very well protected. But on the other hand, this has led to, for example, a piece of cheese is twice expensive in the Canada than in the United States, and each Canadian consumer complains about that. The Canadian farmers enjoy a very lucrative deal, but they sell cheese very lucratively, but then they end up buying Asian and namely Chinese equipment. I didn't want to say China, but now I guess I have to. But then, as a result of these negotiations, the United States were able to crack open the door of the Canadian dairy market, and of course the Canadian farmers have reacted very vividly. We all returned from Canada and there was a lot of talk about this, but then the Canadian consumer has reacted to this quite positively. So what happened with the liberalization and protectionism? What else? Automobile industry. You know what protectionism caused in automotive in Ukraine. It basically ruined and raised our automotive industry to the ground. The United States want to return their jobs to the United States, and according to the new agreement, there are going to be some origin changes. Now, about 75% of the parts have to originate from Mexico or Canada or the United States, no less than. So likewise, that concerns jobs, where they insist that 45 of the parts of the automobile have to be manufactured by people earning no less than $16 per hour. And we see that this is a good signal also for Canada, because this is going to be used to direct the manufacturing more from, it's going to return manufacturing from Mexico, repatriated to US and Canada. I think this is also another thing which is also a great contribution of Canadian and Mexican negotiators is the delaying of the transition between NAFTA and the new agreement. I think this is quite undecided as of now. And likewise, they have decided that maybe it's not for Mexico and the United States and Canada. They have decided to avoid this manipulation in foreign currency exchange rates in the favor of some countries or manufacturers. Dispute resolution has also been revised very considerably, and What's also been important is the adaptation of this agreement to the digital era. The piracy has been criminalized, and Ukraine has to take note of that because we want to advance our products in information technology and video and content. This is where we have to consider how much our content is protected, because very often our IT manufacturers and our software developers work using unlicensed tools, basically pirated tools. And practically, the duties on digital goods in IP rights have been revised, as well as IP protection rules. You were correct by saying that the duty for metal has been unchanged so far. It's outside of the bracket of the main agenda as of this time. We know that this is a huge pain point for Ukraine, but unfortunately it still exists. Emma, thank you very much. And since we went to, we now transitioned into metal. Now Denis Morozov is with us, who is the head of one of the top managers of Interpipe, one of the largest exporters present in most Ukrainian, most international markets. And your company probably very often encountered trade restrictions and probably took part in trade investigations in many countries. And needless to say, you have experience in dispute resolution in trade. How do you assess the risks posed by the trade wars for the Ukrainian metal industry? Thank you for the question. I represent Interpipe. Probably I'm the only one of the colleagues who really personally feels the influence of these restrictions. Just to say a few words about Interpipe, for the last years, we have invested over $1 billion into numerous projects. We built a Dnipro plant for manufacturing parts for pipes and wheels, and we're expanding our company. It was a very innovative plant. In Ukraine, we are supplying only 25% of the products in Ukraine. 75 we export, 75. Even though we're Ukrainian origin as a company, but we are a major exporter in over 80 markets over the world. And the trade war didn't start with Trump. It's not the fact. It's not that. I think everyone's been doing this for many years. Is there a slide here that can look? This is starting with 2017. This is the picture. If you pay attention, this is the example of our pipe products. All of the countries are closing down. The Russian Customs Union, European Union, USA, Canada. There have always been restrictions. How is the so-called safeguard war different? Before, the wars used to be bilateral. So let's say the US would introduce a duty or a barrier, then the EU would introduce a barrier in return. Now the US introduces a barrier, but it opens a safeguard of everything on everyone, including Ukraine. What's the logic? And they say, what if the Ukrainian pipe manufacturers are going to just re-export pipes from the United States, and they're going to resort to dumping. And this is the new trade war, which is attributed to Trump, but it's been long before Trump that this has been happening. Just what I want to say is, it's a very important takeaway from the discussion that we had, that the state will always protect its national manufacturers and industries. As much as we like to talk about liberalization and free economy, free markets, this is a very beautiful theory. This is a very beautiful thing to say, but the hard reality of life is that there are always the so-called insiders in the country who pay the taxes, and they create jobs nationally, and they lobby the national governments. And this is where the trade barriers don't emerge out of nowhere. What is the point of investing into lowering the cost of your product if there's some kind of commissioners and investigations, and they will they will introduce an anti-dumping margin where it's going to eat into your revenues. So, for example, just here's an example. There's a duty for scrap metal. Now they have expended a duty of €42 on scrap metal for 1 more year, and this is a real bad thing, and the European Union has been criticizing us for a lot. They say this is protectionism, this is wrong, but then our product. There's a 13% duty on our product, which is €100. So we pay €100. We pay €100, but then against €42 on scrap metal, there's no logic. If it's a free market, let's make it free. Let's cancel all the duties. Let's make it transparent. Why do we make one barrier? We make one barrier while we criticize another barrier at the same time. And an important takeaway for me is that the local industries and the state have to collaborate, and they have to fight for external markets together, because this is taxes, this is jobs. We have in the U.S. we have an agreement which we have extended for a year. So, which means we will sell no less than minimum prices, but we won't pay a duty. This was a collaboration between the Prime Minister, the President, and the Ministry of Economic Development and Trade. And with a titanic effort, we were able to prolong this agreement for a year. But then the European Union, on the other hand, has expanded their duty, 13% duty for 5 years. So they have expanded their safeguards. So we've been working with the Ministry of Economics, with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but they turned a deaf ear to us. Unfortunately, we were not heard. So the trade wars continue. There's nothing to do about that. And another example about scrap metal. Sorry, I've been talking about scrap metal so much, but this is a real pressure point for us. There's a so-called Transnistrian Republic, which used to be the biggest buyer of scrap metal from January to May, and there would be 50 to 60,000 of scrap metal transported there. We don't know where the profits went, but the National Defense and Security Council has included this plant as a sanctioned entity. So the scrap metal was supposed to stop going there, but it still goes there because there are different schemes, there are different bypassing arrangements, and by the railway cars of the Ukrainian railways, it's still going there. So the stream is continuing, because even though it's not creating jobs, it's creating a deficit in taxes. Just in conclusion, we're not expected anywhere in the world. Basically, a trade war is a war of all against all. So we have to build a strong team between politicians, the states, and the manufacturers to play for our team. And the trade war didn't start with Trump. It was there all the time, and right now this is a given in the world. Everybody's at war. Everybody's trying to lobby their industry, and this is, unfortunately, I believe that this is irrevocable. We have some minor victories. We have some case studies, but let's expand on that and keep going. Well, if you maybe I was a bit too emotional, but since you mentioned scrap metal, I have a question to you. Now, the state has supported the metallurgical sector, has curtailed the export of scrap metal. Are companies such as Interpipe ready to modernize themselves thanks to these subsidies from the state? Like I said we have invested $1 billion, and we will continue investing. We have also announced a portfolio of $200 million, which we plan to invest in 3 years. In any case, we are developing and we plan to grow, so it's very, very important for us. We are going to keep doing this. This is a key thing for us, the reduction of costs. We invest into digitalization of our enterprises, and we have partner companies which we work in ERP, we work with IT systems automation. We're trying to save each dollar on cost, because each dollar today is a possibility to compete tomorrow.
If there was a free market, we would be very competitive, because we have one of the least costs in the basic costs in the world. Would you like to protect the internal market as well? Another slide, please. I'd like to illustrate concerning the state procurement in Europe, how they, so to say, don't lobby and promote their companies. They say everywhere that the company should be of EU origins. The HERA group, ACAR, the supplier should have at least one factory on the territory of EU. Let Interpipe, they say, buy at least one factory on the territory of EU, and then they'll supply their goods. An example from Poland, they need the minimum of 50% of EU origin goods. They love to speak of the free market. We'll buy your high quality and well-priced goods. They need EU origin. This is normal. This is fine. I support this. There's no such thing as liberalisation and free trade. This is what we have. Why Ukraine is afraid to do this is beyond my understanding. Concerning safeguarding in Ukraine, this is a philosophical issue. In order to close and safeguard something, first we need to create something, the market, meaning a small rate of our sales is in Ukraine. The other batch goes abroad, and there are many ways for development here. What we promote and lobby here, we need to develop the value-added chain here. For instance, the machinery that takes up most of the machinery of the metallurgical produce. All of the steel produced in Ukraine will be used inside the country as well. We will not be forced to fight for foreign markets. We shall produce the value-added products. When we built our Dniprostal factory, the Italian credit agency called SEC gave the money for it. When you want to build a factory, you use the loan from foreign companies. Why can't we have such loaning companies in Ukraine? Our machinery companies can produce equipment and railroad cars. They could be of high quality. When foreign clients come, they need loans. They need financing for such agreements, and the industry will do well. Development, drilling of, I'd like to praise the drilling of oil and gas, the potential of Ukraine, and this is good for us. The produce that we are making is being bought in larger amounts, in larger scales. The utilities, the roads, the infrastructure, it should have investments from commercial, from state objects. The Ukrainian market will boost, and with that we could support it, we could protect it. Of course, the export and credit agencies is very needed in Ukraine. There are initiatives of promoting that. We shall hope for that. For 3 or 4 years we've had similar initiatives. Johannes, would you like to comment on the question, answer the question that Dennis mentioned?
The good thing that Ukraine joined the WTO agreement and signed the EU free trade agreement is, if there's a provision in tender documents which actually stipulates a price preference, this is, with one exception, the utility sector, it's not allowed. So Ukraine now has the Ukrainian company, which is not treated equally, has enforceable market access rights. So this is one of the main advantages under the GPA. So you could turn to the competent body, public procurement review body, and say, this provision in the tender documents is not okay because I'm discriminated. So just as I said, Ukrainian companies now have rights, but of course you also need to enforce them. You can enforce them in the national court. You could also bring a claim to the dispute resolution body, or my friends who know it, when you're actually attending the GPA committee meetings, Ukraine could actually address this and make this an issue and saying a Ukrainian company is discriminated in an Italian or a tender, So that this issue is also raised to the political level, because, and I cannot talk about this particular case, but it seems that it's not justified. So again, Ukrainian companies could actually do something against it.
Okay, you're absolutely right, but what I want to tell you about this, they can remove this EU origin in paper, but in reality they will use it in any cases. Because they say, sorry, you're a Ukrainian company, we want to work with EU companies. And EU origin for us is main key. That's why we can remove from paper, but not from the real life.
Yes, absolutely right.
For me, it's lobby. This lobby, it's a very good thing. They make lobby for their producers. Very good idea. I think the same.
I fully agree. From a legal perspective, it's not allowed. From a practical, it's different. And actually, I think now Ukraine has access to the European Union and other countries. So maybe for the beginning, it's a good idea to team up with local companies. You could enter into a joint venture. You could act as a subcontractor, which maybe makes life easier in the beginning. But I fully understand that it's the same if an Austrian company.
You know, we do this. We start in GV with Valorec, and today we will produce pipes together and sell to Europe, because we cannot open this market. It's only one way to make GV. And we started, I think in October, we'll produce the first pipe in our GV with Valorec. You're absolutely right.
Денис, спасибо вам большое. У нас в гостях...
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Johannes. Mr. Igor Kuzhva, for a long time you've worked with the Ministry of Economic Development of Ukraine and participated in the negotiatory group, more than one, on creating free trade zones. And nowadays you are a co-author of a number of draft legislation for protectionism. How would you comment on today's world situation, what we've heard from other participants of discussion, and how will it all influence Ukraine? Thank you for the question. First of all, I'd like to mention that today in the world there is really an escalation of trade wars, and the world financial crisis of 2008 became the driver of this process. Just for your reference, starting from 2008 and until today, all of the countries introduced over 9,000 protective measures, and most of them are currently efficient. And they are there will be more of those. The leaders on introducing these measures are the largest economies of the world. For instance, the US have introduced almost 1,500 protective measures within the last decade. India, Germany, about 800 measures, Russia and Brazil, about 500. Ukraine, by contrast, a little bit over 70 protective measures. It has introduced those. Also, there is a tendency of a larger arsenal, a larger scale, a larger number of these neo-protectionist measures of protecting the trade. It's very decent explaining this by ecological or human rights issues, but also sometimes they explain this as in the European Union, for instance, the state procurement is protective measures, sometimes give their favor to companies that have energy efficient component. For instance, the EU or Canada agreements would not save us from such protectionist measures. Basically, for instance, we have agreements and we have certain growth, but what about our macro results? 2/3 of our exports are raw materials and over 50% of import are ready-made goods. The import into state procurement is 38% in EU, and in the US This constitutes about 5–6% max. Also, in Ukraine, there is a critical, chronicle deficit of trade balance. The next year will see $11 billion of that. And we also will have to loan the foreign currency and to service it. By contrast, in Ukraine, within the next decade, there's been over 70,000 of protective measures towards Ukraine. According to a global trade alert, the EU implemented about 137 protective measures towards Ukraine. About 3 anti-dumping investigations against Ukraine. Concerning Ukraine, according to the same agency, according to the same source, Ukrainian measures of the same kind constituted about 10 measures. The law on moratorium for export of timber, of forest materials, of scrap metal. Also, I am aware that the European Union is very worried about the new initiatives from Ukraine, for instance, buy Ukrainian, pay with Ukrainian currency, which uses the same model of tender offers. Taking into account the localization, the American and European mirroring continuing the same model that is used in EU and America, the tax preferences for industrial parks. In Ukraine, there is no similar protective measures against the European Union. We should see them not as protectionists in nature, but as additional instruments for investing into Ukraine, because these measures are aimed at solving ecological problems, providing our enterprises with access to raw materials and financial resources, and for the EU, it is a certain opportunity to invest into Ukraine, into the green energy, aerocosmic sphere, and machinery, and so on. Another example, what we should have done with last year and the year before that. The high-quality timber, we should ban export of that into European Union. But why should we have this initiative? This is an exclusion from the World Trade rules that is based on the ecological. This was introduced due to the ecological catastrophe that we have nowadays in Ukraine. We could have held joint consultations and dialogue. We could have invited the European Union officials to visit Carpathians and see what is happening. Many European companies are placing their factories in Ukraine. We should protect our ecology. And what signal could we give to European companies to come to Ukraine, to open factories here? The minor problems that the European companies had, and compared to the opportunities that these companies could have, the manufacturing and export of timber from Ukraine, it cannot be compared. This could be a win-win situation for the European companies and for Ukraine, but this is exactly the issue that lacks understanding between Ukraine and the EU. Our trade bloc should become stronger. We should also take into account the global tendencies, the causes of all of the trade wars. I am firmly convinced that they happen because of the competing for raw materials markets, and afterwards for the markets for selling the ready-made goods. And Ukraine, in this fight, in this competition, is suffering and has the worst image, has the worst situation concerning that. Thank you, Igor. Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to ask you to comment on the most recent words. How should Ukraine protect itself when the large world economies are taking protective measures against Ukraine as well?
It's not about protecting itself. If Ukraine wants to increase its exports, it's very simple. There are two things to do. Two things. First of all, you take over the EU norms and standards through the harmonization of the Ukrainian legislation with the EU one. And the day Ukraine will have taken over the EU norms and standards in most economic sectors of its economy will be part of the EU single market, which is the main trade bloc in the world. Voilà. And this is today the main obstacle to the export of Ukrainian goods, not other things. And second point, if you want to attract foreign investors to transfer your raw materials, your wood, for instance, you know what you have to do to enforce the rule of law. When you ask European companies why they don't come to this fantastic country, which has an highly skilled labor force, the best industrial tradition one can imagine, the best agricultural soil, fantastic touristic potential, why don't you come and invest to Ukraine? Because of the lack of rule of law? Because if I have tomorrow a raid of my company, where do I go? Which judge is independent and fair? Which court is working seriously? This is the main obstacle. We don't have to invent other things. These are the two things. If you want to increase your imports, you implement your exports to the EU market, you implement the DCFTA through the harmonization of legislation. And you will remove most of the obstacles to trade between the EU markets and Ukraine. And if you want to attract foreign investment, rule of law, rule of law, rule of law.
Спасибо большое. Йоханнес, еще тогда...
Thank you very much, Johannes. One more question to you. If Ukraine adopts the law based on the principle buy Ukrainian goods, will it be closer to harmonizing with the EU legislation?
According to the government procurement agreement and the EU free trade agreement, there are some exceptions. It's exceptions to the rule of fair treatment and equal treatment. But these are exceptions. So actually, by national policy, in principle, it depends, will likely not be in line with the basic principles according to WTO and according to the EU public procurement directives. But because I'm from Austria, actually I think there is a way of, let's say, smart protectionism. As I said, it would be naive to think that European member countries are not promoting domestic industry. And it's good, but I think you can do both. You can do it in line with international obligations. And because I'm here to talk about public procurement, so for instance, what we do in Austria, we use quality criteria when choosing the contractual partner. I understand in Ukraine, 98% of all tenders are based on the lowest price. So actually I published a guideline on how to promote domestic industry by basing a tender procedure on the best value, not the cheapest price. We could talk about this for hours. You could actually assess the quality of the key personnel. You could assess some environmental criteria like the distance the truck has to go You could divide big tenders into smaller lots so that small and medium enterprises have a possibility to bid. So what I believe, there is a gap, but it's possible to bridge this gap to promote domestic industry, and this is something Ukraine should do, in particular in this difficult economic situation. But nobody prohibits Ukraine to do this in a smart way, to do it actually in line with its international obligations, and I think this is possible.
Спасибо большое.
Если можно одну ремарочку, да. Johannes, вы свое...
Thank you very much. Johannes, you helped consult Ukraine for Ukraine to join the WTO procurement agreement. So thank you very much for that. So we'd like to start, maybe organize a foundation from the Ukrainian industries to build the institutional base so that the tools of developing public procurement is a tool to develop national industry in line with WTO and TA.
In the beginning, Ukraine joined this agreement. And I think there are immense opportunities, but Ukrainian companies are not making the best out of these opportunities. And it would be naive to think that now Ukraine will win hundreds of tenders abroad. But as I said, we talk about such a big market. If Ukrainian companies would only win a fraction, this will create jobs in Ukraine, it will save jobs in Ukraine, but competition is tough. Nobody is waiting for a Ukrainian company. So you have to go out there, you have to get effective, and you just have to be better than other companies. And this is the way to do, and it's not easy, but I had the privilege to assist Ukraine, I think now for 7 years, and of course I'm always happy to do this in the future.
Спасибо большое. У нас уже почти не осталось времени, но все же, может быть, есть вопросы.
Thank you very much. We're very short on time, but we have microphones for a Q&A session. Please do use the microphone if you want to ask a question. Good afternoon. I have a question to Hugues Mingarelli. I was on an exchange program in China for a month, and for all institutions that we visited, they said that China and the United States are in the middle of a trade war, and China is saying that they will win the trade war. Actually, looking at them, they do stand a chance, but they are also said that within this one belt or this one route, they are being reoriented to the Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and they want to compensate their supplies to the United States instead of the with the European Union. They're also using bilateral mechanisms such as $2 billion investment into Belarus for technology and equipment. What do you think is the perspective and opportunities for Ukraine in this regard? Because every trade war creates opportunities equally.
I disagree with your last sentence. There is no winner in a trade war, first of all. And second point, the one who are hit the worst are the weakest. Because in a trade war, you basically give up on all rules which have been commonly agreed. C'est la loi du plus fort. So there is no winner in a trade war. We hope that we will avoid once again a trade war, even if you say that we are already in a trade war. No. What you are trying to say, and you are right, we have to be frank and open, is that each country is trying to promote its companies, its exports, and its investment. But that's clear. There is no doubt about that. In the EU, in many member states, you have an unemployment rate which exceeds 10% of the population. You have in many EU member states between 10 and 20% of the population which is under the poverty line. It's clear that each country try to promote its companies, its exports, its investment abroad. But this does not mean that we should not try to have commonly agreed rules to avoid this war, which in my view, once again, hit first of all the weakest and the poorest. Well, coming to your question about the One Road, One Belt Chinese initiative, well, we know that they are planning to invest a lot in Eastern and Central Europe. What will happen, frankly, I cannot tell you. Many people have questions and doubts about this initiative. They are not that sure about what will really happen on the ground. We will see in a few years' time. On our side, we consider that it is our common interest to develop connectivity between Europe, and you are part of Europe, and Asia.
Эта техника нам, наверное, уже напоминает, что у нас время подходит к концу.
If we can develop transport, energy and telecommunication networks between Europe, including Eastern Europe and Asia, it will be to the benefit of everybody, and on our side we will support such initiatives without any doubt.
Спасибо большое. Есть еще вопросы в зале?
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions remaining?
From London, so it's quite an investment company. My question is about Brexit. What do you think the future of Ukraine in terms of Brexit? Ukraine and EU, Ukraine and the UK. What are your considerations and thinking about that? Thank you.
If nobody wants to answer, I can say a word. First of all, we regret this decision which has been made by the British people through their referendum. We hope that it will be possible to agree on the strong relation between the EU and the UK after the exit, after March 2019. Regarding Ukraine, I don't know if we have any British colleague in the room, but we know that the Brits are already starting not the negotiation, I'm not sure they have started to negotiate. They plan to have a strong bilateral trade agreement with Ukraine. We hope that this will be the case, because our wish is obviously to ensure that Ukraine will continue to be able to export and to have strong trade relationship with the UK. And I have no doubt that this will happen, because we know that the UK has always been a strong friend of Ukraine. We see it not only in the economic field, but in the political and security area as well.
Я поддержу. Мы будем дальше сотрудничать, постарать поставки делать. Вот сегодня в London Tube в метро.
Well, we will continue doing this. Right now, in the London Tube, they're using our wheels. Our wheels are rolling there, even today. Do we have any more questions? Just literally, it's a remark. It's not a question. I don't know if you want to answer this or not. The European Economic Senate. I'm listening to this panel discussion. I have an impression that there is an actual war ongoing. It's like two villages that didn't. But here's a head-on remark. I have an understanding that Ukrainian companies are categorical rather than trying to look for agreements. Like in the European Economic Senate, we don't have big Ukrainian companies represented, such as Interpipe. How do you build the policy against which you are opposing? You are forgetting the fact that these are relationships. This is more than just people sitting in the government and they're trying to play a game of chess while saying that, oh, maybe just let's let's get the Ukrainian companies out of here. There's no human contact. You don't understand, you don't get understood, and this leads to a war, and this changes the tactic. I know all of the European commissioners that are handling our issues. We once per week, we meet with different lawyers in Europe. We have lobbyists. We communicate on all levels. Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Economy. Well, just trust me. I don't have to tell you. I would rather just do business, economy, and finance in my company. But most of my time I spend for these trade wars. And you're not right. We knock on doors. We keep talking, but we're not heard. A final question, please. I have a question to Ambassador Mingarelli. There's a fact that the European there's a free trade agreement between Europe and Ukraine regarding. Do you see the participation of Ukraine in the in the European Customs Union as the next step? There are some prerequisites in terms of politics and economics, but just like Turkey, can Ukraine look in this direction? Secondly, I have a question to the representative of Enerpipe, because in 2011, 2012, as a result of trade war, with the so-called war with the Russian Federation, you have lost a portion of the Russian market. So did you have a way to replace the Russian markets with the European markets? Thank you.
You say free trade agreement between Ukraine and the EU. No. There is a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. A free trade agreement is about removing custom duties. In a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, beyond the removal of customs duties, our main goal is once again to remove all non-tariff barriers to trade, which are today the most important obstacle to trade. Between WTO members, the main obstacle to exchange are not custom duties, because the custom duties are already very low. They are non-tariff barriers to trade, norms and standards. This is why it is so important for your country to focus on that before looking beyond, before looking to a customs unions. It's clear that we are ready to deepen our cooperation in the customs field, no doubt about that. But today, on our agenda, we have the implementation of the DCFTA, because almost everything has still to be done, to be clear, okay, in terms of harmonization of legislation. So let's focus on this for a few years' time, and then we will reflect on the next step.
Со своей стороны скажу, вы правы абсолютно.
On my behalf, I'll say that our sales to Russia and satellites was about 45%, but now we have 13%. But this is a result of this trade war. I won't comment on that. But I think all of these tariffs and non-tariffs is because we lost, in a way, this. We were invited into the free trade agreements with the European Union and the US, but finally what we see is tariffs, barriers. So what happens is when you become big enough, they start investigations, anti-dumping cases, and they limit your sales. This is an idea of a typical trade war, and this is what everybody does everywhere. So for us, it's very difficult for us. Why do we sell into 80 countries? And it's not because we're that good, but because we try to sell wherever we can. Wherever there's demand, we try to come there. So it's UK, it's UK. If it's Oceania, we're going to sell to Oceania. It's our task. And unfortunately, right now, all of these trade wars and these barriers and these tariffs are a severe hindrance to our business. But the investments that we do, we can't see a return on them because we get barriers imposed on us who eat into our investments, into our ROIs. So it's not about free competition. It's not about who's more efficient. It's about who has a stronger lobbies to create barriers. It's like Renata said, now the anti-dumping tariffs are more difficult than national security exceptions. No, both of them are evils. It's not about the lesser evil. We either have to remove all barriers, just like Adam Smith told, invisible head of the market. But if we do barriers, let's not be hypocritical about it. I'm sorry for saying that. So 2 words on the results of our panel. As a result of our discussion, we'd like to say that sooner or later, all of the trade wars will sooner or later come to an end, and I think this wave of trade disputes is going to settle down, but I think largest economies have to reach an agreement. But I think we have to wait for the reformation of WTO. Thank you very much for this very substantial discussion. Thank you to the speakers, and thanks to the participants. So we offer you to continue discussion on coffee.